Alright, how's it going? My name is Brian Mayado. The current date is November 2nd, 2025. Uh, this is my final submission for the course called SEN 4930C. This is my final year. I'm currently enrolled in Valencia College, and I'm currently trying to obtain my bachelor's degree in computer technology and software development. And the name of my project was called News Trends, which should have been obvious by the picture, but there you go. Now, let's get on to actually talking about what's the project about. So, the point of the project was to create a script, or sorry, the intention of the project was to create a script that would call and retrieve data from a online web API that was centered around the news. Specifically, it was to get the total results from to get like total results as a data type from gathering like from searching specific key topics, which you'll see in a bit, which actually you can just see right here, and then visualize that data. And then on top of that, other things included stuff like automating the gathering of that data, as well as using some version control, because you gotta be safe like that. So as you can clearly see, there's a little demo here. This is not the only time we're gonna see data for this. You're gonna see more of it in in a different slide. But for the time being, you know, here's a basic idea of how it was supposed to go. You have keywords. So here are some of the keywords. Oh, we ended up going with 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Obviously, don't worry too much about the keywords that were actually used. It says nothing about me politically. It's just what I chose because I wanted the data to be interesting. And then obviously the date that it was gathered, which is October 13th, you can presumably guess it was 2025. And then obviously the total results for when that search was done on that day. So, basically there were 28,853 news articles created for, were created with titles that included the word China. But let's get into more specifics, shall we? All right, languages and tools used. As I said earlier, I used a script. I used an online web API. I wanted to visualize it. I wanted to automate it. I wanted to use version control. But I never described it necessarily what the specifics of that entailed. So let's get into that. We have IntelliJ, which was the IDE of choice, the integrated development environment. Basically, it's just a place you use in order to write source code, edit source code, compile source code, and then debug source code. That is basically the intention of what this is for. So that is IntelliJ. As far as programming language, I used Python. Why did I use Python? Well, when I was reading over the requirements for this course and reading over sort of the big, because I knew there was going to be a big project at the end of the course, and I knew that the goals that were set upon me in order to be successful in this semester. Uh, and it was clear to me that it was predominantly about displaying proficiency in data science. And when I think data science, the first two like programming languages that jump out to me are like C and Python. But I don't have experience in C. Well, not that much experience. I have barely any experience in C. And Python, however, was actually the first programming language I used. So I will say, yeah, I just chose it because that's something I was more comfortable with. And also because, again, I associate the language with data science. As far as the web API that I used, it was newsapi.org. You can go check it out if you want. It's got, it has tiers. Oh, be careful though. It has tiers, and I'll get into the constraints of it later. But um, basically, there are some limits to using newsapi.org. But hey, it worked very well for this project, so there's that. As far as visualization, I used Powerby. That is, developed by Microsoft themselves. Very nice, very useful, very fast. I made it. I used it predominantly just because it was very quick, very very quick at creating very effective, structured data, basically. Or sorry, the display of structured data, whatever. As far as how I actually stored the data, right? Because you have to obviously store it before you can actually go out and visualize it later, right? So the point, what I used was CSV files, aka comma separated values, and that's about that. As far as automating the data, as far as automating like when the script actually runs, so that I don't have to do it myself and like accidentally forget, or because I didn't do it at like a specifically certain time. Because I wanted to make sure that I was gathering the data at very specific points in the day, aka at the very very end, very tail end of the day, aka 11:59 p.m. Because that would obviously constitute that day more accurately. So yeah, that in order to make sure that I wouldn't miss that day or anything like that, I use an automated script. I automated the the activation of that script using Windows Task Scheduler. So yeah, and you'll see that later. And GitHub, which you're going to see that later. Hey, I'm going to say that a couple times for this presentation. Implementation, as I said earlier. Okay, so I'm pretty sure this is about talking about the direction that I wanted to go with while I was implementing stuff. And yeah, these are definitely the two topics that came up the most. Or the most, at least they stuck out to me the most, which was I used Powerby. This was not something that was necessarily described in the scope, mostly because I didn't really have. Well, actually, no, I think I actually described it that I was going to create a my own my own visualization for it using stuff like pandas and stuff like that, or basically using some sort of like Python library or framework in order to actually develop a functioning UI that would visualize the data that I gathered through the script alone, because that way it obviously just automated it all on its own. I ended up going with a very, cause I just didn't want to have any room for failure, and I just wanted to get it done. So I used Powerby instead, just to guarantee that I absolutely would have a functional, very effective visualization of my data. So that's why I ended up with Powerby. And as far as English-speaking news outlets, I didn't realize that the news API that I was using in order to obviously gather the data for news topics, I didn't realize that it actually was able to gather news articles from outside of the U.S. I thought it was just predominantly the U.S. It is actually all over the world, which would include Chinese, French, Spanish, the like. So because I didn't want to end up having data that would well, first it'd be obviously bias. Um, it obviously would obviously because the keywords that I use were all in English. So like if I use the word like China or Israel, like those terms might be different in different languages. So that is just to say that I wanted to make sure that I was limiting it to only English-speaking countries, which you'll see that a little bit later. But yeah, that's basically something that I didn't realize until I was implementing it, that I realized that I had to start looking more into. Findings and results, negative trends and popularity. Okay, obviously, okay. As you can clearly tell, there is no data here that I want to, display or anything like that. I'm just going to describe the results that were found, mostly because I'm going to show the data and the data that was collected and the charts that was collected a little bit later. But just know that this absolutely, like, you're gonna see both of these things. I swear. So the first thing is negative trend. There is a weird consistency with the data that I've gathered, in that for some reason, after accumulating over a week of data on this stuff, it had a tendency to go down for some reason. I have no idea why this is necessarily the case. Like, I can only guess. So, take this with a grain of salt. But if I had to take a guess, it is because sometimes the articles that are collected are sometimes deleted. Like, as in, some articles are created purposely to be temporary, and the news API that I'm using gathers that and considers it, like an actual article, and then later on it gets deleted and then it goes down. That, or it's possible that the API that I'm using is gathering news articles, and sometimes it's gathering news articles from like different countries, obviously English speaking, and for some and then like it duplicates that article, and then sometimes later, and a couple days later, it'll recognize that those are duplicates, and then it'll remove it, which causes a bunch of it causes the negative trend, which shouldn't happen, because in theory, this kind of data should only accumulate, right? Like only more articles should exist for this given topic. They shouldn't necessarily go down. So yeah, that was something confusing about it. And again, I hate to not show it, but yeah, it's going to be very. But like when we get to the demonstration, you'll see clearly all that stuff. So yeah, and then popularity. That's another. I mean, that's a given. So as you're collecting data for the stuff, you can see which topics are clearly more popular than the others. So yeah, that is that. Technical challenges. All right, Python. Okay, so earlier I said that Python was the first programming language that I ever used. That is definitely correct. However, there is just one problem with that. I hadn't actually utilized Python in a while because of the fact that I kind of had to drop it a little bit for the use of Java, especially once I was actually in this course and in this program at Valencia College. They really hammer home Java, so Python really had to fall into the wayside for it. So I had to relearn a little bit of it, but I'm not, I probably could have coded it in Java. So switching over to Python, it wasn't really a big deal, but it was still technically a challenge. Visualization, as I said earlier, I didn't know whether or not I wanted to do it, myself, or if I wanted to use, some other tool or framework or what have you, or if I wanted to use, go crazy and create like a React application to go actually display it for me. But I ended up just doing, going with a very simple option that I knew wouldn't fail. And News API, as I said earlier, I mean, you're working with a web API you've never, actually worked with. That's kind of inherently the point, right? Is that you go online, you see some random web API, and you need to go check if it actually will work with your, the project's goals. So I had to go check if it worked with the project's goals, and like there's some constraints with it. Like obviously I needed an API key. I needed to, obviously the API URL. How do I actually interact with the API? There was stuff that these are all things that are luckily very very neatly um, displayed in News API. Like it has all that stuff. It has everything, including oh, and thankfully there's also a free tier, so I was able to actually interact with it without having to blow a bunch of money on something that was very temporary. So that was very nice. Project do-overs. Alrighty, I'm gonna get into it a little bit later, but for the time being, I'll just describe it now. SQL is definitely something I probably should have used when I was gathering data instead of using a CSV. And you'll see why a little bit later, but for the time being, just know that that was definitely the case. Like, and it wouldn't have been hard either. I could have easily just used something like because it was non-relational. I could have easily had just done something like use MongoDB because it's very it's notoriously very easy. That's kind of like the point of it. And I could have definitely used that to store my data with some actual columns that are named, and you'll get to see why that's a problem later. Python visualization library and frameworks. Because obviously I didn't do that and I used Power BI instead, a lot of the automation that could have been there and that could have been very easy on me to actually just visualize the data through the script itself isn't there. And because it's not there, it makes it obviously on me to manually go, display the data, which it's all. I mean, it's fine, but it's like, I could have done better on that. I could have displayed that myself, and that's kind of what it is at the end of the day for programming, right? Is to automate stuff so that you don't have to do it. And then positive negative trend calculation. I mean, it is the project is called News Trends, but despite and it technically, by basically, I did technically do this. It's just the fact that I didn't. I probably could have displayed like the actual trend, like the actual rate that something is increasing or decreasing by. It wouldn't have been hard. I mean, if you've taken a middle school algebra, it's YMX plus B. So like I could have easily displayed that somewhere, but I didn't. So yeah, I probably would have added that there. Demonstration time. All right, let's start actually showing stuff off, please. All right. Okay, let me make sure that everyone's seeing stuff. Okay, cool. So here we have the actual GitHub. This is where I this is how I implemented my version control. If I ever wanted to make changes locally, I would put it here after I rigorously tested it, aka after I implemented it. So that is basically it. There's my README. I guess we can talk about. Actually, let's talk about it a little bit later. But the point of it is, yeah, this is just to implement version control. I've also utilized GitHub Desktop, very very useful tool. Very much, it very seamlessly. Like if I make a change to the IntelliJ IDE and I make changes here, let's just do it real fast. It's fine. I don't know. Let's just. Oh, I got it. I have an idea. Let's say I wanted to get another keyword, right? I want to do I don't know. Again, not related to my political party or whatever, but yeah. So let's say I wanted to do another keyword, right? I would go over here and then boom, GitHub would check it and be like, hey, this got changed locally. Do you want to add it to the repo that is on GitHub? and I'd be like yes, or I'd be like no, because there's like a little thing here that says like, what was changed in the file and whether or not I want to add it or not. And then obviously I could say what was changed and all that stuff. And then add a description and then commit the file to main, which would actually only do it locally for main, which then would have to get implemented onto the actual GitHub repo that is not local. But yeah, that's basically a little bit of the pipeline for the version control. Actually, that's all of it for the version control. Um, but yeah, in terms of actually now looking at the source code, as you can see, IntelliJ, as you can see, Python. This is the main. This is main. As you can clearly tell, it fires main, and then it fires every other function that is useful here. It fires all the other helpers. It starts up the News API client. Speaking of the News API client, here it is. I think the most worthy thing of note here is obviously I need an API. I also used obviously because I'm not a fool. I used env to make sure that it was hidden so that people wouldn't see my API key and all that stuff. And here's obviously the URL. I didn't hide that because it's public, so whatever. Um, and the language I use, which is English, cool stuff. As I said earlier, have to limit it to English, and it got limited to only English, based articles. Helpers. I think the most notable thing here is obviously the display. So I displayed it in the terminal in order to just make sure that I was for forms of like testing to just make sure that it was actually working and retrieving data. And then I just did this to just make it look nice. And then obviously the data that I was retrieving was in JSON, and I obviously wanted to use the CSV file, so I had to take the JSON file that was taken, convert it to a CSV file. Basic stuff. And then here's actually the data that's found. Actually, this is not the data that's found. This is the data that is found. This is the raw data as gathered. As you can clearly see, it's just your most typical CSV file. The keyword, the total result, the date. There you go. And then obviously this is a little fun thing you can do with IntelliJ. It just lets you automatically format it so you can see it better. And then finally, I've shown off the data gathering. I've shown off, how I, like the API calls and all that stuff. But let's talk about the visualization. Okay, this was actually much simpler, very simple, very easy, very straightforward. Basically, I would just do get data. It would get the data. I would pick the file that I was using. The file that I was using is called search results. This one's called search results 2 because that's just I had two different ones for two different things. It's fine. And basically, this is the limitation of using a CSV file in that the columns are called just very un with no attribution whatsoever. They're just called column 1, column 2, column 3, which made it very confusing to figure out where I should be putting these columns a little bit. But ultimately, this is one of the reasons why I would have used SQL is just because of the fact that I would have loved to have just some basic attribute names that are actually attributable and actually I could actually understand. And God forbid I was using a different API or I was collecting a data like I was collecting. God forbid I was collecting data for something that had a lot more attributes than just 3. It could have been a nightmare to work with. But yeah, here's some basic results of that data. You can check on certain days. If I wanted to, I could also go to the keywords here. I could filter it. Let's say China. I wanted to look at only China, and see what the trend for that China. See the trend for the keyword of China for news articles in English-speaking news outlets. There you go. And here's a pie chart. This is already being filtered by day. Basically, yeah, it's like how what was predominantly the most popular. Clearly here it was the stock market. Here's a little tip. Here's a little spoiler for you. It's always the stock market. But yeah. Yeah, and you can see the percentage of which one actually was the most popular. And last thing, task scheduler. Here it is. Basically, here it is. Automated news API test. I don't know why it's not. It shouldn't be called a test. It's not even a test anymore. It just actually was implemented. But basically, it was what I used in order to actually automate the script. So it would run on a specific day. Hey, guess what time it ran? It runs 11:59. That's it. That's about it. Nothing more to it. So, and you can also see here, I could have done it when it wakes up. I could have also done it when the computer wakes up, when the computer is, off and on and all that stuff, all that junk. But yeah, that's about it. So let's go back to the PowerPoint. Thanks. Final remarks. This was a lot of fun. I regret making it too easy, but ultimately, this was good.